This is the second video on the 4 major macroeconomic performance goals. If you've seen the first one, you'll remember that the government aims for 4 main things when it comes to macroeconomics. Firstly, it aims for sustainable economic growth. Then it aims for low and stable inflation. Then low unemployment. And finally, balanced current account of the balance of payments. That means exports are roughly equal to imports. So when you see on the exam paper UK economic performance, this is what it's talking about. This video then is looking at inflation. Inflation is a sustained rise in the general price level. By sustained, we mean when the prices go up, they stay up. We're not interested in prices that just go up briefly and come back down again. And general price level, we mean the average level of prices in the economy, the cost of what most people buy. We're not interested in just one good or service, unless, of course, that good is something like oil, where when the price of oil goes up, costs of other goods go up as well, because oil is used in making lots of things. So that's what inflation is, a sustained rise in the general price level. We measure inflation by using a price index. And you can think of a price index a little bit like measuring the cost of living for a consumer. So all price indexes take a pretend basket of goods, and we see how much that costs and how much it costs next year. And then we compare that with the year after. And we weight that basket of goods. So we're much more interested in what happens to the price of petrol, which people spend lots of their money on, and we're less interested in what happens to the price of bananas, which people don't spend much of their money on. So we weight the goods in those pretend baskets according to how much people spend on them. There are 2 indexes you need to know about at A level, and they both work on the same idea. They're both trying to have this weighted basket of goods, but they look at slightly different goods. There's the CPI. The CPI is the Consumer Price Index. It's used across Europe, so we can compare with lots of other countries and see how inflation in the UK is comparing to inflation in France or Germany or the Eurozone as a whole. And it's the government's preferred measure. So we use it to see whether we should be putting benefits up or down, pensions up and down, that kind of thing. The major thing to know about this is it doesn't include some housing costs. That makes it very different to the other measure you need to know about, which is the RPI. The RPI, or Retail Price Index, is the index the government used to use. The main difference is that does include housing costs. And that makes a difference, because that means that when the interest rate goes up, then people's mortgages go up. So the RPI tends to rise, whereas the CPI tends not to. So that's the big difference between the 2. This is the one the government used to use, which is why lots of people still quote it. There are 2 major causes of inflation. First of all, we have cost push inflation. Cost push inflation happens when firms' costs are going up and up and up, so they put their prices up and up and up. The second type is demand pull. This is when people are demanding so many goods and services that the economy just can't keep up with them anymore. This is the type of inflation that we were talking about in the sustainable growth video, if you remember that one. So we need to be able to draw each of these for AS, and I'm going to assume that you know how to draw an ASAD diagram. For a cost-push inflation, all we need is a short-run ASAD diagram. So there's my real national output, or real national income on the bottom of the axis. Here's my price level up the side. And when firms' costs go up, we show that by drawing a new short-run AS curve. And what that does is it means that firms have to put their prices up in order to keep some kind of other profit, in order to cover their costs. So output goes down because firms are facing higher costs, and they put their prices up. That can be a particular problem because it can lead to what we call a wage price spiral. So firms' costs go up, that means that they put their prices up. Then workers say that they need a pay rise because they can't afford as much as they could before, so wages go up. Well, that puts firms' costs up, so their prices go up, so people ask for higher wage rise, and we get the spiral and it goes round and round and round. So that can be a real problem for an economy. The other type is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation happens because we can't meet demand with the supply we've got in the economy at the time. So again, real national output and price level. And this time, it's because we're nearing our productive capacity. We're nearing this vertical bit of the long run aggregate supply. And so when AD goes up, price level rises with it. So we have more output, but the price level's gone up too, because we have to pay more to squeeze the last bit out of the factors of production we've got, because we're nearing that full capacity. The final thing we're going to look at is some of the costs of inflation. Now, there are lots of costs of inflation, but there are a few that you really do need to know about. The first one we're going to call shoe leather costs. That's the cost that people face going round time after time looking to see if they still have the best price. Now prices have gone up because of inflation. Similar to that, we have menu costs. That's the cost of actually physically changing the prices. And you might be thinking those are really small costs. And you're right, they are, as long as inflation is low and stable. So if the government's meeting its target of low, stable inflation, then they don't have too much of a problem. These costs are very small. Most firms will be changing their prices anyway. The big cost comes when inflation is very high or bouncing around. Another cost that we might need to think about is savers. Savers lose out because inflation is eroding away the value of their savings. Although borrowers win. Borrowers end up with the value of their debt being eroded away. So actually, while savers don't like inflation, borrowers do like high inflation. The other group of people that lose out are people on fixed incomes. So some types of benefit, some pensions, they don't go up with inflation. So when money is losing its value, those people can buy less and less and less. There is, though, one benefit to inflation. And that's that it encourages people to spend. If you know prices are going to be cheaper next year, then you wait to spend your money till next year. If you know prices are going to go up, you spend it now. And so inflation actually encourages people to spend, and so it can help economic growth. That's why the government doesn't set a target of 0. The government has set the Bank of England, whose job it is to control inflation, a target of 2% CPI inflation. They can go as high as 3% or as low as 1%, but they're aiming for 2%. If they fall outside of that, if inflation, for example, ends up at 3.5%, or as it is now, below 1%, then the Governor of the Bank of England has to write the Chancellor an open letter explaining what happened. So that's a quick summary of inflation then. Inflation is a sustained rise in the general price level. We measure it using the CPI. And it can either be cost push caused by firms' costs going up, or demand pull caused by us starting to run out of spare capacity. There are some downsides to inflation, but most of them are quite small if inflation is low and stable, which is why we aim for 2% CPI inflation. It's just worth saying, when you start to look at policies for solving inflation, the key to those sorts of exam questions is deciding what kind of inflation you've got. If I've got demand pull inflation, I can solve it by just reducing demand or increasing capacity. If I've got cost push inflation, or even worse, a wage price spiral, then I need to think about ways I can stop those costs continuing to rise. So improving competition, reducing the power of workers to force up wages, all of that will help to stop cost push inflation.